Okay. Tutup display saya, Bu. Ready. Yeah, I'm ready. Remove the chair. What's the chair? Here's the chair. Okay, what's the chair? Ladies and gentlemen, kindly take your seats as the opening of the second day of our SEASIA Conference 2002 will be commenced shortly. The Honorable Chairman of Research Organization for Social Sciences and Humanities, National Research and Innovation Agency, Professor Dr. Ahmad Najib Burhani, officials of National Research and Innovation Agency, Steering and Organizing Committee, discussion chairs, speakers, presenters of the 4th SEASIA Biennial Conference 2002, all distinguished guests. Good morning. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In today's occasions of our second day of the 4th SEASIA Biennial Conference, with a theme entitled Managing Disruptions, Developing Resilience for a Better Southeast Asia, held in Jakarta. My name is Sharifa Aini Dalimunte. I will serve you as the host for today's roundtable discussions. Without further delay, we commence our today's agenda for virtual roundtable discussions. We have Ibu Ayu Surtiari here from National Research and Innovation Agency, or BRIN. Our roundtable 2 discussions entitled Governing Systemic Risks and Cascading Risks in Southeast Asia. Ibu Ayu will moderating our 1-hour discussions today. So for Ibu Ayu, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Sarifah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Roundtable Discussion 2 with the title Governing Systemic Risks and Cascading Risks in Southeast Asia. Let me introduce myself also. As Sarifah already mentioned, I'm Gusti Ayu Ketut Surtiari, a researcher at the Research Center for Population, National Agency for Research and Innovation. I will be serving as a chair, and I wish to thank our volunteer here and all team to prepare and also support us during this session. Our session will be 1 hour. We will finish at about 9:35 because we delay for 5 minutes. Each speaker will have about 15 until 18 minutes. So because we are waiting for one speaker more, and then in total, we will have about 15 minutes question and answer at the end. All participants are welcome to write down their questions in the chat box. So during the presentation, all of the participants can write down, and then I will post the question during the question and answer session. Oh, welcome for Professor John McCarthy. So we already have 3 presenters here. We have 3 panelists. First, Dr. Giancula Pescaroli from University of College London. Thank you for coming. This is very early in the morning in London, I guess. And then the second panelist is Dr. Helena Farke from Malaysia. Good morning, Dr. Farke. And then the third, Professor John McCarthy from Australian National University. Before we start, I would like to give a brief introduction about our panelists that's very expert in this topic. First, Dr. Giancula Pescaroli. He is the Assistant Professor in Business Continuity and Organizational Resilience at University College London. His research investigates how to build and improve the continuity of operations during disruptive events, how to minimize their impacts, and how to increase the resilience of the public and private sectors. This includes managing complex challenges such as cascading risks, critical infrastructure failures, systemic and compound dynamics. He also worked the impact-oriented, aiming to bridge academia and practice. So he has a lot of publication, and then currently he is also active in consultancies for local authorities and international organizations on topics such as resilience to cascading scenarios and stress testing. And in 2020, he became a director of University College London's multidisciplinary master program in risks, disaster, and resilience. In 2021, last year, he organized the masterclass Stress Testing for Building Infrastructure Resilience with the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, or UNDRR, UCL, Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction and Resilience, SEAS. The second speaker, Dr. Helena Farki, is an associate professor at the Department of International Strategic Studies, University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Her research focuses on the governance of transboundary pollution or haze in Southeast Asia. More broadly, she seeks to understand how the economic development can be reconciled with environmental sustainability in this resource-rich region. The findings of her PhD at the University of Sydney has been published as a book in 2016 as part of Routledge Malaysian Study Series entitled The Haze Problem in Southeast Asia, Palm Oil and Patronage. She has consulted for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Academic of Sciences Malaysia, and the ASEAN Secretariat on these topics, and continues to undertake research in this field. Currently, she undertook a visiting senior research fellowship at the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore in 2021. And the third, we have Professor John McCarthy, the associate professor in the Resources, Environment and Development Program at the Crawford School of Public Policy, Australian National University. His research focused on the question of governance institutions and rural development with a focus of forestry, agriculture, food security, and land use, particularly in Indonesia. He is, along with Rob Cram, the co-auditor of the Palm Complex, Smallholders, Agribusiness, and the State of Indonesia and Malaysia. He has lots of publication about about Indonesia. So without further ado, we can start our first speaker, Dr. Pascaroli, to present his presentation. We will learn a lot about the concept of systemic and cascading risks. So for Dr. Pascaroli, the time is yours.
Hi, thank you very much. Can you confirm if it's 10 or 15 minutes? Because the email was read 10 minutes, but I can speak for how much you want. Good morning again, everyone. By the way, I'm Luca Pescaroli from the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. It's an honor to be here. In central London, it's actually 2:48 a.m., so my apologies if my face it looks a bit tired. But I look forward for this presentation. So just tell me exactly how much you want me to speak right now.
15 minutes, please, Dr. Pascaroli.
No problem. So I'm gonna give you just a brief overview about what I intend for complex systems, cascading effects and escalations, and then some practical problems you may face when you deal with complexity in terms of capacity building. So in terms of how we answer and we deal with cascading risk. So the first thing is that, as we are seeing now, everything we are doing is completely different, and what is happening and what we are seeing after COVID-19 or even with the war in Ukraine is an increased dependency on global networks, is an increased dependency on technology. So the way our society evolved all across the world is changed completely behaviors. To make you an example, this week I have been in Japan. And the way I was dealing with the emails with my colleagues and with my department, but also the way our meetings were held with somebody in the office and somebody remotely is really different than what we were conceiving before, how the workplace was before. And if we think it about in terms of disaster management and systemic risk, we are seeing that there are different elements together. So we have on one end the fact that we need to be aware that two or more things can happen. So if we think about the last 2 years, I'm sure that in your experience, there was less something else when COVID was going on. So I'm sure that you have seen with your own eyes some moment in which you had to care about the pandemic, but you had to care also of something like an heat wave in Jakarta, maybe about flooding, storms, or maybe you were concerned because your laptop was subject to cyber attacks. At the beginning of the pandemic, my own eBay account was hacked. So we are dealing with a system that is more interconnected and is affecting our life more than before, and the way organization operates, both in emergency response, like firefighters, hospitals, and both in the private, public and private sector, are completely more reliant on technology. From the need to having a stable Wi-Fi connection to have a conversation like the one we have now. And think about this, 10 years ago, a thing like that won't have been possible, right? It won't have been even thinkable that somebody on the other side of the world would have taken a camera and speak to you in the middle of the night. Then you have the example I was making before, the capacity to, now that the restrictions are a bit over, to fly one place to the other. Like the other day I was in Japan, this weekend I will be in a meeting of the Society for Risk Analysis in Barbados. And the way this is conditioning the global supply, think about what is happening in Ukraine and the global shock that is happening on the food supply chain because of the crops that are still in the harbors. And seeing this as a whole, we are all dependent on a very basic thing, energy supply. So when you think about it, I could have a blackout now happening for different reasons. Maybe Boris Johnson had an issue with the Russians, or simply there was something that went on wrong on the grid. But what we are doing have different level of dependency on technology, and then the world we are facing is much more interconnected and is seeing much more concurrency due to climate extreme, but also because things are more complex than before and more things can happen at the same time. So when we think about contemporary crises, it's not just the linear development that we were used to think years ago when we were teaching emergency planning and management, but it's more a matter of shifting our focus and our attention to how we can keep things running in situations where many things can happen at the same time and they're all interconnected. So think about what is a worst case scenario in your experience. What are low probability and impact events? I'm sure that even if you think even just 2020 as a pre and post line, well, what is a worst case low probability scenario? I was having a discussion years ago with a colleague in space physics, okay? And this is interesting because I'm a social scientist, as many of you, I believe, and talk together. For somebody in the physical science, low probability and impact doesn't mean this is not gonna happen tomorrow. If I speak with a policymaker or somebody dealing with senior management in any kind of organization, what is gonna happen is that if I see low probability and impact events, they are gonna take it most likely as this is never gonna happen. We cannot allocate resources on it. When I talk with a colleague in the borough, so the local authorities in London, so London is divided in many small places. Well, their first responders, they have limited resources and maybe they have the River Thames on the back of the door. So their problem is, I need resources and I need to focus them on the water of the river, because anything else is more remote for me. But the approach that we are proposing is, it's not that the water of the flooding is the problem. Considering everything as a whole, the problem is how to address resources to be ready for that, but also for the other things that can happen with similar or different triggers. If you think what there is common from a flooding, for example, and a storm, well, you can have the same power failure, right? So think what happened in Texas during COVID-19. You had a pandemic peak going on. You had a cold wave. And then I was coming back from the US in March, and I was sitting near somebody in Austin, or from Austin, that had the mother stuck in the house without energy for 3 days. And you're gonna see that you can have a lot of stories on that. I'm used to say that when I was at the beginning of the doctorate, I come from the city of Parma in Italy. Parma is known for Parmigiano Reggiano, Parma ham, that beautiful spot there. My parents live in the hills, far away from the city, but there was a lot of flooding, okay, city center. My family lives 25 kilometers away, and there was a telephone hub that went down, and for some days afterwards, there were 3 million people in all the region that were without phone, including my parents that were not affected by the flood water. And at the same time, there was this local civil protection that were not able to communicate because a telephone hub was down. So when you think about all this and the implication of what we're seeing in terms of climate risk, concurrency, is that whatever is coming is going to impact on infrastructure network that are the backbone of our services. And whatever we are seeing, it also the emergency facility that are supposed to act in case of disaster, in case of crisis, are subject to the same need for supply, the same need for continuity. So the point becomes shifting from what we were traditionally used to conceive as disaster reduction, emergency planning and management, to conceive systemic risk as something that requires us to prepare for disruption as a praxis, as a baseline, independent by the organization you are in, independent by the field of research you are in. If you don't have a backup and you're stuck by a blackout, you're gonna lose, if you're a researcher, 3 days of work. Let's put in an example. So this topic, systemic risk, cascading risks, shift the attention from response to assuring the continuity of services and what is operational continuity in general. The principle is that no organization, no person is an island. So no one is alone. We are all interconnected. What we are doing is all interconnected. And the raising prices in the food in Jakarta may be associated with the harbors in Ukraine that are still stuck because of a war, right? There are different examples on that, also on many other things. An example that I'm used to refer lately is something that came up in an exercise done by the colleagues of Arup and the Greater London Authority on power failure, on black start events. So when the electricity grid goes down as a whole. And this one was simply mentioning that most of the insulin is produced outside the United Kingdom. And if you don't take care carefully in a situation of crisis, of distribution point of insulin, this is going to be a massive problem because the supply is going to go down and the distribution toward the hospital is going to be more challenging. So in practical terms, cascading risk and systematic risk require a shift of mentality. in which nobody of us has the expertise to do alone, and we are interfacing with different colleagues in different disciplines to find complementarities. From colleagues of the engineering side, working on a physical assessment of building, to right now, the last thing I'm doing, like literally this week, is collaborating with colleagues in the management side about enterprise risk management. It was something that was not even in my radar like 3 years ago. And this is done because systemic risk itself cannot be addressed without thinking about which points are gonna escalate in case of failure. If you go and check the last contribution paper we published with Professor David Alexander and 2 colleagues of the Greater London Authority for the United Nations Global Assessment Report 2022 that has been released within last month, you're gonna see that we are suggesting something radical. To start to think together with how to keep organization running and how to prioritize services there to act on operational continuity, also to rethink how we are prioritizing societal need in case of disruptions. One of the big lessons learned that I have personally for COVID-19 is that when I was thinking and talking with my friends in Italy or in the UK about what is your core problem out of this emergency, some of them gave me an answer that for me was actually quite what? So it was something I didn't expect. And many of them at the same time came out that their core problem was not a limited disruption, for example, of cash flow, was not a limited disruption of refrigeration, because they had all the tools to deal with it. Their core problem in business as usual for that situation was childcare, because in that case was becoming a point of failure, because the services that were provided before with COVID-19 were lacking. And at the societal level, for where I come from, with people keeping on working on other things, this was becoming a serious problem for the continuity of their work, their life, and their psychological well-being. So the way to deal with that is increasing awareness of what we published recently on Nature about stress testing. So starting to have an organization thinking how you're gonna understand your common point of failure for different scenarios.
Dr. Pescaroli, 2 minutes more.
Okay, I was counting 1 minute, so I'm literally on the conclusion, but thank you. So consider starting for grades. First, don't think just 2 scenarios that are just a flooding, an earthquake. Things are gonna come together. So start to consider complexity and systemic risk as different things that combine together. Then start to ask yourself, to your stakeholders, to your project partners, what are the common point of failure between different threats? What else is going on? What is gonna escalate the situation if a certain thing is not working? So for example, in a situation like us today, do you have a backup in case of the main connection internet is going down? For me, is the provider on my phone that is different than the one I have at home, because I was used to teach online for part-time of the year. Start to think, where are you? And most of all, start to think how you can develop your capacity in very practical terms, because the action that we need for dealing with systemic risk and cascading risk is not often rocket science. It's something that can be, in terms of governance, acting on something very basics in terms of strategies, training, and putting the basis for keeping operational in situation of high uncertainty and situation of technological failure. So I think my time is over now. Happy to take any questions later and looking forward for the contribution of the other speakers.
Yeah, Thank you very much, Dr. Pescaroli, for the very excellent presentations. You gave enlightenment about the nature of risks with the characteristic of interconnectedness, uncertainty, and linear. So we will have further discussions during the question and answer. And then we are going to the second speaker, which will also give us the perspective of the nature of risks with the title of the Transboundary Haze Governance, Risks and Resilience. For Dr. Farke, the floor is yours. Also 15 minutes, Dr. Farke.
Hello, can you hear me? I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, thank you. So let me just try and rewind my presentation to the front.
Yeah, maybe I also can remind all the participants can write down the question in the chat box. Thank you.
Sorry about that. The presentation has gone missing. Let me try again.
Do you mind if we share your presentation from our side, Dr. Farke?
Yes, I think it's better for you to do that.
Okay, then. Please wait a moment.
Yeah, now it works. I can see the slide now. Dr. Farke, okay.
Hold on, yeah. There's a bit of a lag here.
Dr. Farke?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. And actually, we can already see the presentation in the monitor.
Okay, yeah, just a minute because I can't see my presentation. I'm so sorry. I think
Oh, okay.
not used to WebEx, so I'm a bit.
Yeah, this is always technical problem.
Yes, I'm so sorry about that. Maybe you can just stop and you can cancel my presentation and you can share on your side because I can't see, so I'll just proceed
Oh,
to
yes.
talk.
Okay, we will close the presentation from here.
Yes, so I don't want to waste any time. So
Yeah.
I think better you just show it on your side and then I will try to, yeah, I think, yeah. So this is, you are sharing, yeah? You are sharing the screen, yes?
Yes, we already shared it to the participants and they
Okay.
can see it on our
Thank you. So sorry
screen.
about
Yeah.
that. Good morning, everyone. So obviously I'm not used to WebEx, but so apologies for that. Thank you so much for inviting me for this panel discussion. I'm very honored to be part of this with Dr. Gianluca and especially Prof. John McCarthy, who has been very influential and important in my work for many years. So I'm very honored to be on the panel, especially with him. So I'm going to speak about transboundary haze governance and how we can contextualize this in terms of risk and resilience. So I am unfortunately not an expert on risk, but just contextualizing in terms of what I can relate to my work. So when we talk about resilience in the region. Actually, resilience is something that has been discussed and has been of concern to ASEAN for many years now. So, for example, in the Social Cultural Community Blueprint 2025, there are specific sections that discuss the importance of resilience, as well as how this can be, how resilience can be increased or can be assured. So this includes things like integration, partnerships, empowerment. All this is very important. And the ASEAN leaders have actually committed to forging a more resilient future, specifically in terms of resistance to disaster and climate-related risks. So you can see the detailed quotation in the blueprint. I won't go too much in depth, but perhaps we can move forward to the next slide. So specifically on transboundary haze, this has been my subject of research for about 15 years now, not from the context of resilience, but more in general. But basically what I would like to contextualize it in our topic today is that haze is a disaster, all right? So it requires disaster management. And it's been a problem in the region since at least 1983. So what this means is that it is not a low probability disaster like what Dr. Gianluca has mentioned, but actually it's a high probability disaster. We know that it's happening. We have certain predictive mechanisms to predict when it would be more likely for us to face this problem, and also the extent to which this problem will affect ASEAN states. So sometimes on a very mild year, it could just affect like 3 states. But on a bad year, it can affect up to 8 ASEAN states, or almost all the ASEAN region. But this disaster is definitely something very complex. So, if you want to divide the different types of haze that we have haze in the northern part of Southeast Asia, and we also have haze in the southern part of Southeast Asia. So in the north, in the Golden Triangle area, it's quite different. It's related to sort of annual crop cycles. But in the south, where we are based, it is a bit more complex in the sense that there are fires mainly originating from peatlands, and mainly in Indonesia, sometimes in Malaysia as well. And they are linked to sort of the long-term cycles of key agribusiness sectors like palm oil and pulp and paper. So it has a lot of relationship with business links, with political economy, national interests, these kind of issues. So it's a very complex issue. And the effects of haze, of course, is throughout the system, so what we call systemic risk. So there's environmental effects, so you would have crops that fail. You would have social effects, students can't go to school, they cannot play outside. Health effects, there have been research on the tens of thousands of additional deaths that have been caused by haze during bad haze years. And we also have economic effects where, tourism goes down, manpower is reduced, and various other effects. And I would say one example of a cascading risk is the diplomatic effects, where certain haze originates from one country, but then it actually affects other countries, and this can also affect diplomatic relationships between these countries as well. I'm not sure if I'm categorizing it correctly in terms of risk categorization, but just my layman understanding of how we can link all this into systemic and cascading. But anyway, the blueprint that I mentioned to you just now specifically talks about haze as a risk and the importance of building resilience against this issue. Next, please. So when we talk about haze and resilience, what is usually discussed and usually promoted and held up is the resilience of businesses and the resilience of societies against risk. So for example, businesses will take out insurance policies against risk. They will try to minimize the impact of downtime. So if workers cannot work during the haze times, how can they overcome that problem? How can they reduce the impact of this downtime? And also in terms of employee hours, how to remain resilient despite the threats of haze to the business environment. Societies also have become very matter of focus. So, for example, to protect students or youths from being exposed to haze when they need to walk to school or walk to work, countries like Singapore have been organizing free car rides. Many countries have been giving out free masks, and this is to make sure that society can live and continue to live in a very close to normal, continuous lifestyle during haze. But what we don't really talk about is the continuity and the resilience of the environment. And if we bring that down to the sources of haze, we have to talk about the peatlands and how resilient is peatlands in the face of haze and in the face of climate change. The simple answer that peatlands are simply not very resilient, and it's just the nature of these areas. So the way that peatlands are formed, it takes hundreds and thousands of years to form. But once they are drained or they are disturbed for agribusiness, the whatever carbon that is released into the atmosphere, as you can see the picture here, peatlands are usually flooded. As soon as they are drained, all the carbon material that was underwater are exposed to the atmosphere, and they very rapidly decompose, releasing all the carbon into the atmosphere. And this cannot be restored. The carbon is gone. It's already into the atmosphere, accelerating climate change. And it also becomes very fire prone as well. So there is no resilience here. You cannot re-flood a peatland and hope that everything will be all right. The carbon is already released. So because the nature of peatlands are very unresilient, good governance from the very beginning and the continuity of this governance is very important. Next, please. So I'm going to talk about governance of transboundary haze from the ASEAN and the Malaysian perspective. Please continue to the next slide. So ASEAN has been trying to govern this issue at least since 1985. So there's this continuity here. However, the effectiveness of this governance framework is, of course, up to question, because after so many decades, we are still facing haze. So some of the arguments that have been raised by scholars is that, there's a limited effectiveness of ASEAN governance capabilities, perhaps due to the ASEAN way of engagement. So things like non-interference, the non-legalistic approach, and very interestingly, the focus on economic growth, since haze is very linked to key economic sectors, have all been pointed as reasons why there is a lack or there is a reduction of effectiveness of ASEAN haze governance. However, despite all that, we do have arrangements, plans, agreements try and address haze collectively. So one of them is the Agreement on Transboundary Haze Pollution, the ASEAN Agreement. And this agreement is very interesting because it's one of the few legally binding agreements in ASEAN, which is quite abnormal in the context of the ASEAN way, which is great, but it is lacking certain important enforcement mechanisms. So what this means is that certain allowances or certain mechanisms in the agreement cannot be operationalized. So for example, things like giving assistance. The issue with haze is the faster assistance is provided or the faster you address the problem, the better, because if the fires are allowed to fester underground, they can spread over large areas and it becomes harder and harder to control. So for example, under the agreement, we have allowances for almost immediate assistance from neighboring countries. However, due to the limitations of, for example, non-interference, we still have to go through various countries' approvals before the regional assistance mechanism can kick in. And this has caused, lateness in response. And there's also the issue of the blame game that continues to happen between countries. So, for example, Indonesia will frequently point out that Malaysian companies are actually also involved in this, and this often this often has a bad effect on the willingness of countries to cooperate when they start pointing fingers at each other. Next, please. So this is an example that I would like to give in Malaysia to show the importance of policy continuity and how this can actually affect regional level response to haze. So Article 4.3 in the agreement actually encourages states to take their own legislative measures to implement their obligations under the agreement. So we all may have heard of the Singaporean Transboundary Haze Act, which actually empowers Singapore to bring to court anybody who is responsible who has found to be linked to haze existing in Singapore. And this does not limit only for Singaporean entities. So Malaysia was actually inspired by this, and they said that we want to have a similar act as well. However, the response from Indonesia to the Singaporean act was quite negative, and Indonesia was quite unhappy about Singapore's unilateral input of this act or unilateral action on this. So what happened was Malaysia said, okay, we don't want to get into similar problems. Let's take a step back and not pursue this. But then Malaysia had a change of government. The Pakatan Harapan came into place, and along with this, a lot of quite progressive changes happened, including the creation of a Ministry of Climate Change. And 2019, we actually had a major haze event. And when this happened, it triggered Malaysia and the ministry in particular to revive this law and saying that we, in order to avoid the problems that Singapore faced, we're only going to target Malaysian entities in Indonesia. And there was a lot of progress. There was expert consultations, there was drafting, the law was supposed to be presented in Parliament, but suddenly there was another change of government in 2020. And then what happened was, and also COVID-19 happened on that, on top of that. And what happened was, because the government reverted to the old government, or rather some old guards, the law that was proposed was very close to fruition, was actually scrapped. And again, there was a focus back onto enhanced cooperation. However, of course, a lot of critics was raised because enhanced
more minutes.
Okay,
Sorry,
enhanced
yes, thank you.
cooperation was the same thing that was happening before that was not very fruitful. So we see that the lack of policy continuity resulted in, sort of a flip-flop of responses or further enhancement of the agreement according to what has been stipulated. Next, please. So my main point here is that there is very important to have continuity in environmental governance. In Malaysia in particular, we have a long history of single party rule, and this has resulted in Malaysia not really knowing how to continue in change because they're so used to having a very stable single party rule. But the problem with this is if you don't know how to manage change, any abrupt changes in policy direction will compromise environmental resilience. And what has resulted in this, in the bigger picture, ASEAN does continue to engage in a non-legalistic manner. Malaysian companies continue to fall in that gray area of governance because we don't have this law that can govern the actions of Malaysian companies in Indonesia. And Indonesia at the same time is a bit unwilling to engage head on this. And peatland governance remains very much with the country where the peatlands are in, even though we have ASEAN arrangements on peatlands as well. And this also sends a weak message for local fire and peatland governance agencies that the regional level is not really going to support or contribute much to what they are doing on the ground. Next, please.
Yeah, maybe you can go to the conclusion.
Yes, this is my
okay.
conclusion.
Thank you.
So in conclusion, I would like to bring up the point about risk and resilience, the importance of good governance to support environmental resilience and to manage risk. But also we have to be very conscious of the importance of policy resilience, especially in the face of frequent governmental change, which I think is something that is more and more of a norm in this part of the world. Thank you so much, and apologies once again for the distractions at the beginning.
Yeah. We got more understanding about the nature of risks. So now we are moving to the third speaker, Professor John McCarthy, will present the paper with the title of Changing Agrarian Scenario, and the COVID-19 pandemic, uprising rural vulnerability in Indonesia. The time is yours, Professor McCarthy, for 15 minutes.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much for Bryn for the invitation and for the panel organizers. It's nice to give a presentation for Bryn. I've got many friends and colleagues. I did a PhD with someone from Bryn who is in the office next to me. It was then called Lippy, so it's nice to be involved. And hello to Helena. I've read many of your papers, but we never met face to face. So it's nice to put a face to all those papers that I've read over the years. So what I wanted to do today was draw on some recent experiences and research that we've been doing. So going back at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research asked me to help them do a rapid assessment of COVID-19 and food security in rural Indonesia. And I did this in collaboration with a set of terrific colleagues from Indonesia, from UI, UGM, and from also from USU in North Sumatra. So it's a great opportunity to think about some of these things. And they reached out to many of their networks, and we were able to bring together this paper that's available on the.
Excuse me,
internet.
Professor McCarthy, can you put the slideshow? Because here we see the presentation not really full.
Is that good now?
But
Oh dear. That's a problem. I'm not used to which one is it now on the right?
but yeah, now it's work. Yeah, we can see full now.
You can see the full one now. You don't see my notes.
No.
Good. Okay.
I don't see your notes. Just put
good.
the full slide, full screen. Yes. Perfect. Yeah.
There's a full. It should be full screen now, is it?
Yeah, without notes, but still not full
Okay.
screen.
I won't do it. I'm afraid. It won't go to full screen.
But this better. You can continue, Professor.
Okay. I'm sorry about this.
No problem.
You must used to Zoom as well. So basically, the framework that we used in trying to analyze food security outcomes in Indonesia, and I think this is widely applied elsewhere, is to try and think about the drivers of change, the immediate and proximate shocks, such as well as COVID, of course. At this time, there were problems of pest incursions, also climate-related issues. And then we also tried to think about exposure, who's exposed to the risk, the different sensitivity and impacts across Indonesia, the responses of different groups, and the recovery potential of vulnerable groups. So there we got to thinking about the degrees of resilience and the food system outcomes. And of course, there are multiple feedback loops across all these different things. And we're also interested in looking at the interaction between all these elements and looking at the opportunities for transforming Indonesia's food system to make it more robust, resilient, and more effective. And also trying to avoid maladaptive strategies, which increase vulnerability. So here is a list of some of the patterns of exposure and risk that we found. And I think these are also relevant to many other parts of Southeast Asia. First of all, in Indonesia, we see over the previous decades, falling poverty, but persistent stunting and nutritional insecurity. So 30% of the workforce in Indonesia, and I think this is similar to many other countries in Asia, still in the agricultural sector. And 1 in 5 households lives below the poverty line. And in Indonesia, around 30% of children are stunted. And the rates of undernutrition are much higher in rural areas. So these are the people that are particularly exposed. And then we get the structural deficit in rice and high food prices, with which expose people that depend on buying food in the market. Thirdly, we get exposure to climate change, pests and diseases. Rice production is trending downwards, and in the year we did the assessment, there was a 13% fall in harvests. And particular areas are really susceptible to droughts, floods, and other climate events. And fourthly, we have shifts in non-food crops as people take up commercial crops and as the plantations and other big agribusiness sectors expand. And we also get dependence on the labour market, which means that most people, even in rural Indonesia, are dependent on 50% of their income from off-farm activity. So that if the wider economy slows down, they're left very exposed, particularly if people in the city can no longer, their relatives in the city who've migrated to the city are unable to send remittances back. And then we get forest and fisheries transitions where people can no longer depend on harvesting things from nature the way they might have in the past. And finally, we need to look at the situation of women who are exposed in particular ways due to their the position they occupy in the labour market and their position as their dependence on agricultural prices and the way their household context functions. And that these kind of shocks can affect women in particular ways. So we need to be really aware of that. So those were the main patterns of exposure and risk that we found. It should be noted that, of course, this slide just shows you some of the different sorts of livelihood landscapes across Indonesia. And it's also true for other parts of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is incredibly varied. And we get patterns of exposure, sensitivity, and recovery potential and resilience, they're widely variable. So the problem is that policymakers like to think in terms of blueprints, but the responses really need to be tailored for different sorts of livelihoods. And I'll come to this a little bit later. So policymakers like to think about scalability, expanding a policy idea smoothly on a large scale, but with this enormous contextual variation and with outcomes very different in these different sorts of landscapes, we need to think more in terms of production systems and how people cope so that we can actually help support them. So actually this point really comes home in the latest IPCC report, where they make a distinction between communities of scholars that are focused on risk and scholars that are focused on vulnerability. So risk is really important, incredibly important, but they define it in terms of potential for adverse consequences from a particular driver. But the problem is that often, although we can think in linear ways, like if you play billiards, you can think about how the white ball hits a black ball and it moves across the table. The problem is that in social life, things are much more complicated. So Jesse Ribot famously made the statement that vulnerability does not fall from the sky. So in other words, we can't just think about vulnerability in terms of things like climate. In fact, the effect of climate change and the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, involve multidimensional climate society interactions, which involve political, institutional, economic, and social structures and processes, which interact dynamically with contextual conditions to generate patterns of vulnerability. So in other words, although risk assessment is incredibly important, and it's important to think about these cascading risks, when it gets down to the community level, the risk assessment has limited purchase. We need to think in much more complex terms around vulnerability. So some of the things that come out of this kind of understanding, just to break it down, a great deal of research has developed applied climate change risk assessment frameworks and modeled climate change sensitivity. And this kind of work focuses on adjustment to external biophysical changes and mitigating extreme weather effects, etc. So we've got the emergence of discrete projects that make incremental adjustments. But what the literature is saying now that is we need to think beyond this way of conceptualizing risk to think about how people are adjusting to problems like COVID-19. What is the role of cultures and knowledges, and how does this shape what local people think are appropriate social ways of adapting? And if we think about this and we could try and read the local context, this might lead us to thinking about how to support those with the least resources to adapt, and marginalized groups, which are often the people that need our attention. So the IPCC identified an impasse that the literature has talked about for many years, which is this gap between top-down sort of risk assessment models and bottom-down perspectives. And they're thinking that we really need to rethink our predominant approach to risk and vulnerability, bringing in, not abandoning the top-down risk assessment sort of approach, but bringing in bottom-up sorts of approaches. So we've actually been working on a book that we were writing prior to COVID-19. And this is the title of the book. Hopefully it will be out in the next 6 months. So what we did in this book was try and look at processes of agrarian change or rural change in different parts of Indonesia and focus on how vulnerability is produced in these different sorts of landscapes. And the argument here is that if we can look at how vulnerability is produced, we might be able to come up with new ways of thinking about how we might address it. And of course, there's a lot of gaps between what policy does and what goes on the ground. And one of the gaps is that we need to think about the intermediate level between these big policy blueprints and how communities experience risk. We can't just think about this community has this experience and that community has that experience. We have to talk about patterns. And these patterns emerge at this intermediate sort of level. So what we've done in the book, how am I going for time, actually? Oh, no answer there. How much time do I have?
Oh, 5 minutes more.
Oh, 5 minutes, okay. Okay, thank you very much. So what we have developed is a new kind of methodology or a new kind of way of thinking, and this is outlined in the book when it comes out. It's trying to think about how do we capture vulnerability at the community level, and then based on community level studies, how we can make a more generative model. So what we did in thinking about this is we broke down the different elements of vulnerability and look to try and understand how vulnerability is co-produced. In other words, what are the factors and processes that we can identify that actually create local vulnerability? So we developed this heuristic. So in this way of thinking, we look at the processes shaping the COVID-19 pandemic or climate crisis in terms of the most immediate factors or the proximate factors that cause the problem, contextual triggers, which are things that trigger the problem, and then we move down to think about structural mechanisms, the structures underlying the problem. And then we think about social relations, which are really the things that you really see in places like Indonesia or Malaysia, the way the community works, who controls production, who borrows money, who is in debt, who owns the land, how social relations at the local level work. And based on this kind of analysis, we start to develop a deeper understanding of the livelihood trajectories and the adaptive strategies of people. And of course, these things are messy. It's more like a spaghetti than a lasagna, if you know your Italian food. Everything's kind of intertwined. So it's not so easy to take these things, to separate them out. So, and this is my last slide, what this brings us to is that when we think about governing systemic risk and cascading risk in Southeast Asia, we need to bear in mind a number of things. Firstly, shocks and their impacts on livelihoods are not linear. They're like your noodle soup, your mee goreng. The impacts on livelihoods are very variable, they're evolving, and they're highly dynamic. And we need sophisticated ways of thinking about them to understand what's driving these risks and then how we might respond. So policy, where we think about the broader narratives, blueprints, is important because it helps stabilizes prices, it provides social assistance, and it helps soften the impact of these problems. But it often is a little bit, what Indonesians say, kaku, a little bit blunt as an instrument, often not able to look at what we might be up to do, for instance, locally to support local strategies or help people develop livelihoods that are not maladaptive. So one of the things about this way of thinking is that we can open up ways of approaching livelihood risk, which can think about how we can shift communities away from detrimental livelihood and food consumption strategies. In other words, we can think about, well, what do local communities do to avoid risk, and how can we support those adaptive strategies, and how can we avoid maladaptive strategies that create more community risk? And finally, now this is the frontier, I guess, of research, and the IPCC report spends a lot of time talking about it. We need to anticipate transformative strategies that reduce vulnerability and risk. Now, this is where a lot of research needs to be done, and I would like to reach out to Indonesian colleagues and think about how we might develop and assess some methodologies and approaches to deal with transformative strategies for livelihoods. Okay, thank you very much. That's all I want to say today.
Yeah, thank you, Professor McCarthy, for the very comprehensive presentations. I do believe that all the participants have a lot of insights about the understanding of systemic risks and also cascading risks that currently is very new and hot topic in this risk assessment. And actually, we only have 5 minutes more to finish this session, and then we already have one question. I will read the question from the Professor Rosalila Torrecampo from Philippines. So the question is going to Dr. Farke about how successfully implemented are the transboundary haze resolutions approved at the level of the ASEAN Interparliamentary Assembly. Dr. Farke?
Thank you so much to Dr. Rosella for the question. So I am not super familiar with the ASEAN Interparliamentary Assembly process in the context of haze. As far as I know, they have just sort of given out advisories to the ASEAN Secretariat on haze, but I may be wrong. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But in general, in terms of implementation, of haze governance in general through ASEAN, the ASEAN actually has a vision of haze-free ASEAN by 2020, and this is in their ASEAN Haze Roadmap. And of course, 2020 has come and gone, and there was actually a process of stock taking that I was also involved in, on ASEAN Secretariat level, on to what extent has we achieved this goal. So sometimes people think that, okay, the past 2 years we didn't have haze, so that means, there's to an effect it's successful or it's something to be proud of. But when we look at actually the core causes of haze, I don't think we can actually be so assured that the past 2 years did not have haze. There was a variety of reasons. Of course, one of them is the economic slowdown that is caused by COVID. So there was just less economic activity, less opening up of land on the ground, and also the weather issues that was not so dry these past 2 years. So we're actually coming up to a stronger El Nino, at least a moderate one this year, and there's already been predictions, there's already been warnings that we will face haze this year. So haze, I think, will still be a problem beyond 2020, beyond the sort of deadline that ASEAN has set itself. So as far as I know, we are looking at the phase 2 of the ASEAN roadmap to manage haze into the future. And this, of course, ties in very well with the importance of resilience, and especially to address this problem, which is systemic, but at the same time, it is very much anticipated and is not out of the ordinary. So let's hope that the next round of this will be more fruitful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Farke, for the very brief and short answer. I do believe that Professor Reza also got the point from that explanation. Just to short the time, we have one question, very short question from Isabel Desporte. Please, Isabel.
Yes, thank you very much to all 3 panelists for the presentations. I really liked how you also put the focus on vulnerability as a process and something being produced and not a given starting point. So that was very present also in the presentation from Professor McCarthy. I also found it interesting, Dr. Farke, how you said the phrase peatlands are unresilient. Because, I mean, obviously it's not the peatlands themselves who are unresilient, it's the pressure being applied to them and which goes above what they can handle from an ecosystem perspective, which is just too much. So I was also wondering from all panelists, also, yeah, time is short, but what, like, the concept of resilience, which is about always adapting and always like to this complex systemic risk, but the pressure is just always stronger and stronger. And it was mentioned that policies, they have to stabilize the system, but you cannot always stabilize when the pressures keep coming on. So especially also the role of private sector when it comes to agribusiness, when it comes to palm oil, etc. Yes, what's your perspective on that? On not always being focused on the stabilizing role of the government and the adapting role of the communities, but also limiting these external factors.
Thank you. I think this the answer can be coming from three speakers and also as a key message for us. First, Professor McCarthy, please.
That's a very good point. I agree with you entirely. In fact, the literature has now become a little bit critical of resilience, although resilience is important, and the emphasis has moved to transformative forms of policy making and responses. That we can't just leave people the way they are. We need to think about transforming systems or communities or whatever we're talking about to move them on to a different place so that they're not just subject to these problems. So there's a critique there of resilience thinking, but there's also been responses in resilience risk management to that critique. I'll let someone else answer that.
Yeah, thank you. And second, Prof. Pascaroli, please. We cannot hear your voice. Yeah.
Sorry, I was still on mute, it seems. The bottom line is what you mean for resilience. Resilience as a concept itself, if it is not asked too much, is very useful in a systemic perspective because it can help organization to find a more flexible approach to crisis. The point of what is happening is that unfortunately often we associate resilience with a solution that fits everything, or we ask too much to the concept itself. While if we keep it on the practical level, so the capacity to adapt and evolve in organizational terms is very applicable. It's just a matter to see what you're asking to it. I'll make you an example. If we analyze an organization of any kind, like a private sector, and we analyze the capacity to keep continuity in case of complex events, we are going to see immediately that the existence of continuity planning, so BCP emergency planning itself is not enough to see the evolution of these in the short, medium term. So it's just part of the problem. Foreseeing how the organization deals with the network, with the system which is part, you need to shift to the concept of organizational or operational resilience, to which then you can connect stress testing, for example. So I will say that depending on the limitation and the boundaries you take, then everything else needs the use. To my concern, resilience and systemic resilience has a lot of potential, but again, as a simple concept that gives simple answer, but practical answer on capacity.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think Isabella also got the point. Thank you, Dr. Pascaroli. And maybe very short from Dr. Farke because we already time.
It's okay. I think I agree with both of them in the interest of time. Thank you so much for the question. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the three speakers. We got a lot of information and understanding of both the systemic and cascading risks. Thank you very much. And I apologize if there's uncomfort things during the sessions, and then we can continue in another platform. Back to our MC.
Okay, thank you, our three speakers today. Hopefully the discussion will bring us new knowledge on cascading risk and systemic risk and another insights on this new approach on disaster risk management. So ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have a refreshment for 5 minutes before we are joining our next sessions. Again, if you are interested on disaster resilience and environmental issues in Southeast Asia, please stay in this room. We have Dr. Galuh Syahbana as our discussion already here to discuss another 5 papers from our colleague from Taiwan. Thank you and see you in the next 5 minutes.